am the president of the American University in Cairo, and I am delighted to welcome you all here. I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome my old friend from New York, Joe Stiglitz. Joe, as you know, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and a professor at Columbia University, where he's chair of the university's Committee on Global Thought. And this evening, he'll be talking about creating a learning society, an agenda for dynamic societies in uncertain times. I can attest from my years of working with Joe at Columbia that he knows a lot about teaching and learning, and I think we are very fortunate to be able to have him here with us this evening. Two institutions collaborated in bringing Joe here tonight, and I want to give representatives of each of them an opportunity to say a few words. Together, they, Booz & Company, and the Access to Knowledge for Development Center at the American University in Cairo's School of Business, represent the kind of creative, nimble, and innovative thinking that will produce solutions to the vexing challenges of creating and sustaining equitable growth around the world, and particularly here in Egypt. It is no surprise that they have brought Joe Stiglitz here to promote fraud and promote policy debate. First, you will be hearing briefly from George Abdallah, who is partner with Booz & Company based in Cairo. He's advised Middle East government clients on economic policymaking, investment prioritization, and subsidies realignment, has led large public sector modernization initiatives focused on public-private partnerships, outsourcing strategy, and organizational restructuring. He has a master's from the Georgia Institute of Technology, another master's from Northwestern, and an MBA from GW in Washington. Then you'll be hearing from Nagla Risk, who is Associate Professor of Economics and Associate Dean of the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. Her research looks at the economics of knowledge, technology, and economic development, and focuses on information and communication technology, business models in the digital economy, and intellectual property and human development, particularly in Egypt and the Arab countries. She's co-author of the first Arab Knowledge Report and co-editor and contributor to Access to Knowledge in Egypt. She's the founding director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center at AUC, served as a research advisor for Egypt's e-readiness project at the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology. She received her PhD in economics from McMaster University in Canada, and she is an alumna of the American University in Cairo. George, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Stiglitz, good to see you again. I'm actually very thrilled at the turnout. It's a lot of people tonight to hear what I consider a very interesting and thought-provoking discussion that we have tonight. This morning we had a we had a debate with Professor Stiglitz that was attended by a number of business people as well as a number of ministers in cabinet, and we had what I would term a really thought-provoking and frank and open discussion about Egypt, about macroeconomic reform, about what it really takes to move from a 5% rate of growth to the 10% and the 12% that we'd like to achieve. And I hope we can continue some of that discussion tonight. I'd like again to thank AUC, and I'd like to thank you. We're really very proud of our involvement and about our association with AUC. We think very highly of the university, and we think very highly of the students who come here. A lot of the people working at Booz & Company, I'm the managing partner of the Cairo office, have come from AUC, and they have become a fantastic team here in Cairo. So again, I thank you, Dr. Anderson, and I wish everyone an interesting and pleasant evening.
Thank you, President Anderson, for the introduction, and thank you, Booz, for collaborating with us on helping bring Professor Stiglitz to AUC and to Egypt. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to AUC. My name is Naila Riz, and as Director of the Access to Knowledge for Development Center, it gives me great pleasure and honor to host and welcome Professor Stiglitz at AUC and in Egypt, and to welcome you here as a most distinguished guest, of course. If I were to present the full bio of Professor Stiglitz, it would take me the whole evening and well into the night. And I will keep you up late, probably with very little time for him to say much. So instead, I will briefly mention a few of his numerous titles and achievements. And you will know what I mean by just this very brief summary. Professor Stiglitz is currently University Professor at Columbia University in New York. He was Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the World Bank from 1997 to 2000. He was Chair of the International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, appointed by President Sarkozy. He was also the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Clinton. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his analysis of markets with asymmetric information. But not only one Nobel, he was also a lead author of the 1995 report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Professor Stiglitz helped create a new branch of economics, the economics of information, and listen to this, he had major contributions to the following. Macroeconomics, there are students here who know what I mean. Macroeconomics, monetary economics, development economics, trade theory, public and corporate finance, industrial organization, rural organization, welfare economics, income and wealth distribution. I mean, most of us have 2 or 3 fields, but the list and the list goes on. In the 1980s, he helped revive interest in the economics of R&D and had major contributions in the area of knowledge transfer, intellectual property, and development that continue until this very day. He has numerous articles and books and has taught at Princeton, Stanford, MIT, among other universities. On a personal note, Professor Stiglitz has been a tremendous source of inspiration for myself and for my students, many of whom are around in this very audience, and I'm very grateful, like myself, to have him around here with us. Professor Stiglitz will talk to us about creating a learning society, an agenda for dynamic societies in uncertain times. I could go on and on, but I think without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be in Cairo again. And I want to thank you, both Booz and Company and American AIC for inviting me. I should also mention ERF has been trying to get me for a number of years, and it never quite worked out. So I want to also thank them for their. I served in their board, and they've been doing extraordinary important work. So I also feel bad that I never. While I was on the board, I never managed to get here, so I do want to thank them as well. It's very hard to talk about, for an American especially, to talk about any economic issue without beginning with the economic crisis. It has been an event that, it's been commonplace to say the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And the Great Depression really did change our views of economics. And I think, and I hope, that this Great Recession will also change our views on economics. What I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that come out of that as a prelude to talking about the main theme of this evening, which is creating a learning society. Well, among the examples of the views that I think have changed or should have changed, for instance, are the simple views of monetary authorities around the world. Many countries have an dominant policy framework that was spreading over the world was inflation targeting. The notion was that if monetary authorities, central banks, simply get inflation low and stable, it would ensure high levels of growth and stable economic growth. Well, that's an example of an economic idea that was taught in universities all over the world that was wrong. And if there are students who had to suffer on that here, I apologize on behalf of the profession for having wasted your time. So clear, the United States had very low inflation for a very long time. In fact, it was part of what was called the Great Moderation. But that price stability did not ensure economic stability. In fact, I would argue that the excessive focus on inflation detracted attention away from more fundamental issues like what it takes to make a stable, efficient financial system. Our financial system was absorbed in exploiting poor Americans. They got very good at that. The subprime mortgages were really mortgages where they preyed on the least educated, financially least sophisticated Americans. Some discussion, doesn't it make available housing to some poor people? Well, those of us concerned about housing wanted people to have a house for more than 3 months. The idea was that you wanted a permanent house, not one that you could live in for a couple of, maybe a year or 2 years, and then have to become homeless. And our financial sector really failed to do what it was supposed to do, which was allocate capital, manage risk, run an efficient payment mechanism, and instead, the consequence has been a disaster for the United States, a disaster for the world. More than 6.8 million Americans have already lost their homes. That's an enormous number. And 2 million more are expected to lose their home in this year. I mention these statistics just to show the severity of the crisis, that we have not only an economic problem, but a social problem, and that the country is not really on the road. Things have not been fixed, that we have been pulled back from the brink, but the problems are going to be with us for a number of years to come. Well, this is an example of an economic idea that clearly, the idea that price stability was both necessary and sufficient for economic stability is an idea that is clearly wrong. Well, another idea that was in a way related to that, put forward by some of the same people, was that the private sector, private markets by themselves, are efficient and self-correcting. Well, anybody, again, that has looked at America's private sector, financial sector, clearly it was not efficient. No government outside of war has ever wasted money on the scale of our private financial sector. And the loss of resources before the crisis, the inefficiency, hundreds of billions of dollars, but the consequence, the fact that the economy has been operating below its potential, the loss in output from their mistakes is already in the trillions of dollars. And for those of you who don't know, that's a lot of money. The private sector by itself is not necessarily either efficient nor self-correcting. But to put some perspective on this, government also failed. Government had an important role to restrain the private sector from misbehaving. We should understand, the private sector has done this over and over again. The only surprise when Chairman Greenspan testified before Congress, he said he was surprised that the private sector had mismanaged its risks so badly. And the only thing that I was surprised at was that he was surprised. Because if you look at the history of capitalism, we've had crises like this over and over again, about every 10 years. So you have to be enormously historically ignorant if you think that this is nothing new. There is nothing new about this, but it was worse than that. Economists disagree about almost everything. There's one thing that economists agree on, and that is incentives matter. And the financial sector, those in the financial sector, had incentives to engage in excessive risk-taking. Before the crisis, I was a little bit worried, because theories that I had written, others had written, said that we ought to see excessive risk-taking, and this ought to manifest itself in a problem. But it wasn't quite so clear. And if it did manifest itself in a problem, we'd have to rewrite all our textbooks. We'd have to say incentives don't matter. But fortunately, we have a crisis, so we don't have to rewrite our textbooks. And it was a little bit worse than we had hoped, but it was consistent exactly with what economic theory would have predicted. There's another aspect of this, which is when we changed our banking laws, if you look at Glass-Steagall, back in the mid-90s, I predicted that it was going to lead to problems. One of the problems was it led to increasing concentration in the banking system, larger and larger banks. And when you become very large, you become too big to fail. And when you're too big to fail, you again have distorted incentives. Because if you're too big to fail and you gamble and you win, you walk off with the profits. If you gamble and lose, the government picks up the losses. So you have an incentive for excessive risk-taking. So again, we shouldn't have been surprised. What I've been a little bit, I won't say surprised, but disappointed at, is that governments in the United States and most of the other countries have not learned these obvious lessons. They have not addressed the key issues. They have not changed the incentive structures. They've not done anything about the too big to fail banks, anything significant. They have not restrained the excessive risk-taking, the fact that the government continues to underwrite in effect credit default swaps and other risky derivatives by allowing banks, government-insured banks, to write these. As I said, government failed because it didn't, it had stripped away the regulation. It appointed regulators like Greenspan who didn't believe in regulation. And it actually, it did adopt new regulations to respond to the changing economic landscape, like new products like derivatives. The question is, how do we explain these failures? How do we explain the private sector failures? After all, our market's supposed to work. How do we explain the government failures? And in part, the answer in both cases, in part, it's complicated, is that is an issue of governance. In the case of the private sector, there are significant problems with what we call corporate governance, that the managers of the banks were not bearing the consequences of their actions, that the shareholders, the bondholders, did not do very well, but the managers of the banks have walked off with literally hundreds of millions of dollars. So on the private sector, there's a problem with corporate governance. In the public sector, there's a problem with public governance. The financial sector did not invest its capital well, but it invested its political capital enormously well. It invested through campaign contributions, through lobbyists, literally in the billions of dollars. It bought deregulation. It then bought a $700 billion bailout, and then it made sure that it did not get re-regulated to address the problems. What we need to understand is that if we're going to get an economy that works, we need a balance. We need a balance between the private sector and the public. We need systems of checks and balances. And unfortunately, this whole system of checks and balances broke down, and I don't think it's been adequately restored. Restoring it is a big issue, and maybe in question time we'll come back to that. So one source of the problem is this failure of governance. But there's another source of the problem, and that is ideas. I know I don't have to say this in the context of a university, but ideas matter. What people believe about the economic system matters a great deal. A certain kind of ideology distorted policy, distorted what was done. In particular, ideology that I'm referring to, obviously, is what is sometimes called market fundamentalism, the idea that markets by themselves are efficient. Sometimes these ideas are traced back to Adam Smith, who argued that, who modern interpretations argue that the pursuit of self-interest led the economy as if by the visible hand to the well-being of society. Very influential idea. Interestingly, modern scholars of Adam Smith, looking very carefully at what he said, have argued that he didn't say this. In fact, he didn't really believe in the invisible hand. He was doing it with a touch of irony. And that, in fact, he explained very well why that was not true. My own research, for instance, with Bruce Greenwald at Columbia, pointed out very simply, the reason that the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. And that whenever information is imperfect and asymmetric, risk markets are incomplete, which is always, there is a risk that markets are not efficient. Anybody that looks at the behavior of the financial sector, I don't think anybody would claim that the pursuit of self-interest by the bankers, which is sometimes called greed, led to the well-being of the global economy. The point is that these particular ideas about free markets being perfect were not based on economic science. It had already been disproved well before the crisis, and his economic history had pointed out that markets are not always efficient or self-correcting as the bubbles, the cycles, the recessions that have marked capitalism for 200 years pointed out. So what happened was a confusion between ideology. Ideology is often affected by interest, that people have interest in having particular ideas. And their economic ideology went in one direction, and economic science went in another. Unfortunately, economists played a very big role in the propagation of this particular ideology. When I say that, I have to say other economists. Because in many schools of economics, departments of economics, simple models were taught where it was markets work well. So if you assume information is perfect, if you assume that risk markets are perfect, if you assume that everybody is the same, it was called the representative agent model. It's a little bit embarrassing talking to non-economists about some of the assumptions the economists make because they're so absurd. Under those conditions, markets are efficient. So there are some conditions for some other planet in which markets may be efficient, but not for this planet. And yet our students learn these ideas, and then they taught them to their children and to their children, and it became part of the doctrine within the economics profession. So I hope one of the lessons, we talked about all the lessons, I began with the lessons for central banks, the lessons for getting a balance between the private sector and the government, but one of the important lessons is for economists. Unfortunately they got captivated too strongly by a particular set of ideas and lost the balance that they should have had. Well, if we look around the U.S. economy, and to a large extent the world economy, there's one sector that continues to do well in the United States. And that's our dynamic technology sector. Companies like Google, but a whole variety of, in a number of different areas, not only in IT. And that illustrates, where is the economy of the future? And I'll come back to this in the context of developing countries. I think it has to do with the source of energy in a modern economy is inevitably going to be associated with learning in one way or another. It's going to be, this was the part of the economy that was actually creating new products, innovating. The financial sector said it was innovating, and it was. New ways to exploit poor people. New ways to circumvent regulations designed to make the economy more stable. New ways of circumventing accounting regulations so investors could tell what was going on. Brilliant use of human mind to figure out how to move things off balance sheet so no one could know what was going on, not even the bank itself. Which is why the credit markets froze, because the bankers knew that they didn't know their own balance sheet, so they knew that they couldn't know the balance sheet of anybody else. So if you didn't trust yourself, how could you trust anybody else? And so credit markets froze. Totally understandable. And this was the ingenuity of the human mind. But when you think about it, if they had used this creativity to create products that would enhance well-being, we would have been much better off. Well, this raises the fundamental point that I want to focus on for the rest of this talk, which is the notion that comparative advantage, what an economy's strength, is really endogenous. It's determined by investments in education, investments in infrastructure, investments in technology. And this is increasingly so. Every country has some natural endowments, sunshine, rain, land, water. But what really matters is not this endowment of physical assets, it's what you do with those assets. And that is a result of investments. And that, I think, is probably one of the most important ideas for emerging markets in developing countries. Because too often in the past, others have come in and said, well, your comparative advantage is this or that. And if they had followed that advice based on static comparative advantage, their growth would have been doomed. Let me give you an example. A little more than 40 years ago, advisors from some international economic institutions, I won't say which ones, came into Korea and said, you should be growing rice. Korea's comparative advantage at the time was growing rice. And Korea said, thank you for that advice, but no thank you. If we grow rice, if that's what we do, we will be, in 20, 30 years, we will be maybe the best rice farmers in the world, but being the best rice farmers in the world, we will still be poor. What we need is access to knowledge. We need to change our comparative advantage so that we will be producing cars or chips or other products. And they grasped that this was right after the Korean War, and they said, how do we change our society and our economy to go from where we are to where we want to be? And they succeeded. People forget, Korea is now a member of the OECD, which is a club of the advanced industrial countries. When it began its growth strategy in 1960, the average education level in Korea was 4 years. Per capita income in Korea was lower than India. And they said, we don't want it to be that way. And they developed a strategy which in 35 years now has really transformed their economy and their society. When we think about this issue, from the point of view for the economist, one has to understand how different this way of looking at economic policy is. It means that in many instances, it may be worth sacrificing static efficiency for dynamic gain. The notion that you might be willing to sacrifice static efficiency for dynamic gain should be familiar from the point of view of our patent system. What do patents do? Patents give the inventor the exclusive right to use an idea for a limited period of time under certain circumstances. Patents cause two very big inefficiencies. First inefficiency is that they restrict the use of knowledge. And that itself, knowledge is the marginal cost of somebody else using knowledge is close to zero, so that there's no reason, it's inefficient to restrict the use of knowledge. Thomas Jefferson, America's third president, put it more poetically than economists. Economists use the word, they say knowledge is a public good, and therefore you shouldn't restrict the use. Thomas Jefferson put it much more poetically when he said, knowledge is like a candle. When one candle lights another, it doesn't diminish from the light of the original candle. I think that's a really important metaphor of those of us in education. Think of ourselves as doing this all the time. Well, this is the first cost of a patent. The second cost is it creates monopoly. Monopoly is a major resource distortion. So you ask the question, why do we tolerate these inefficiencies? And the answer is, if we have well-designed patent laws, it provides incentives for innovation. We get dynamic gain. So it's a trade-off between static inefficiency and dynamic gain. Unfortunately, many of our patent laws are not efficient, and we don't get the dynamic gain, but that's another matter. The point is that too often, economic advisors, particularly those based on the Washington Consensus ideas, only focused on the short run, on the static comparative advantage, and didn't ask this more fundamental question of how do we create a learning society to change the comparative advantage so that we can go where we want to go, to become a middle income or a higher income economy. So that's what I want to spend a few minutes now talking about. That one has to put aside or recognize that one of the flawed ideas that economists, that Washington census policies pushed was that one should focus only on static efficiency, whereas one should be willing, in certain cases, to sacrifice that in order to create a learning society. And once you begin to approach economics from this perspective, it gives you a new lens through which to approach almost every economic problem. So the lens through which I'm suggesting you ought to look at economic issues is not the conventional one of just static efficiency, but how do we change, transform our society, and create a learning society? A society where people can think about how they do things differently, where their long-run dynamic comparative advantage might lie. Well, it's obviously a very big topic, and this evening I have time only to talk about 5 ingredients in this. The first is to emphasize the importance of education. Now, I always feel a little bit self-serving when I talk about the importance of education, because every businessman I know always begins his talk about how important his industry is. And since I'm in the education business, it's obviously I'm going to think that it's important. And if I didn't think it's important, I'm in the wrong field. But in this case, this is not self-serving. It really is true. Education is important. This was really one of the central themes of the World Development Report, one of the first World Development Reports that was written when I was chief economist. We called it knowledge for development. And one of the themes that we stressed in that was that, yes, it's imperative that you extend literacy to everybody. You have primary education for all, and good quality primary education. But you also have to have good secondary and tertiary education. If you're going to become integrated into the global economy, you have to have good universities, particularly in virtually in all areas. And one of the distinguishing features of countries that have not done well is that they've underinvested in education. That this is probably the single most important what distinguishes successful from unsuccessful countries. World Bank also emphasized, and I agree very, very much, that making sure that education is available for all, women and men, is essential. One of the problems in many countries, including those in this region, are that there isn't access to education, equal access to education for women. So, some high-quality education is essential. We had a discussion this morning about various barriers to the private sector. One of them is access to capital, related with that, in some ways, to the dysfunctional nature of our financial system. But obviously, another barrier is a lack of educated people. That modern economies need educated people. I'll just give you one little one anecdote to illustrate this. People look at China and they think of all the massive unskilled labor, but actually in terms of unskilled labor, China can't really compete with countries like Bangladesh. Its unskilled labor is not really the source of its comparative advantage now in the global marketplace. Its real advantage is the combination of unskilled labor and skilled labor and infrastructure and technology. And it's figured out that you need all of these together to be successful. I was up in the northeast part of China, in a province called Jilin, near North Korea, and visited a car factory that was assembling Audi cars. And what was most impressive was, I went to actually several factories, and they had one factory that was assembling old trucks, very much like they must have trucks 10, 15 years ago. This other factory was putting, in the factory making the old trucks, most of the workers were middle-aged men. And then I went to a factory where they were making Audi, and they all had young men and women working. And I asked them, what level of education, and most of them have 2 years or more of college. I asked them why, and they said, well, these are very complicated, and we keep changing the design, and they have to have people that can quickly learn and respond and then understand why things are the way they are. So the fact is that modern factories, even you might think of what used to be done by people that were just high school graduates, that increasingly require higher levels of skill. Education is also important for a variety of other things, reasons. One has to, that I'll come to in a minute. Most important is openness to outside ideas. That's a second important characteristic that to create dynamism is a kind of openness. And the question is, how do you create that openness? Partly it's through education. Education has an effect of leading to a questioning of authority. As teachers, we always have this ambivalent feeling. We want our students to listen to us with respect, but we also want them to question us. And good teachers always feel pleased when a bright student finds out a mistake in our argument. That's really, that kind of questioning of authority is really a mark of the hallmark of, I think, of a good education system. Very different from just rote learning. So one aspect of openness, obviously, is globalization. Globalization and openness to ideas from outside, products from outside, making one question, essentially, the way things are doesn't mean it's the way they have to be. A third aspect of creating a dynamic learning society is competition. And one of the problems in many closed societies, closed economies, is that there is insufficient competition. As I said before, one of the things that economists agree on, one of the few things, is that incentives matter, and strong competition can be a spur to an important incentive for people to learn and to get new ideas to become more efficient. Especially in emerging markets, developing countries that are relatively small, it's very easy not to be competitive. Countries like Mexico that are characterized by large domestic monopolies have suffered as a result. You would have thought that Mexico, being right next door to the United States, Mexico has a free trade agreement with the United States. So there are in terms of trade, it has a vast market. And yet, in the 15 years since the NAFTA, the North American free trade agreement was signed, Mexico has lost in competitiveness to China. China doesn't have a free trade agreement. And I emphasize, trade barriers are important, but they're not the most important thing. They're not as important as many of the other things that I've been talking about. And unfortunately, one of the mistakes they made was to focus too much on these trade barriers and not enough on the importance of other things like education and competition. The fourth thing that I think is important in creating a dynamic society are industrial policies. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the example of Korea. When Korea said we want to go from where we are, a rice-producing country, to a modern economy, it didn't say, we'll leave it up to the market. It said, we have to shape the market. We can't do everything. The government can't do everything, but it understood it had to shape the direction. Now, some of the ways in which we shape that are the things I've already talked about. Investments in education, making sure that there's competition. But they went beyond that to try to identify sectors where there were more learning benefits, more spillovers to the rest of the economy. It's not a question, sometimes this particular view is criticized as the government shouldn't pick winners. My predecessor was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Mike Boskin once was quoted as saying, it doesn't make any difference to an economy whether it produces potato chips or computer chips. I think he was wrong. That I think that if you're trying to create a dynamic learning society, there's a difference between moving into computer chips and moving into potato chips. There are more spillovers, learning externalities associated with computer chips, and I think Korea has shown that to be the case. Well, there are many dimensions to industrial policies, questions of what are the best instruments, how do you identify sectors that ought to be promoted, again, beyond what I can touch on this evening, but let me mention two important ingredients. One of them is the exchange rate. The exchange rate is a price, but it's a very important price. It's the price at which one's goods compete, sell for in other markets. If the exchange rate is high, the country's goods are expensive, and it's very hard to sell. I mean, just really elementary economics. Changes in exchange rate can have enormous effects. I mean, think about what's happened to the euro-dollar exchange rate as an example. It's gone from from about 0.9 to 1.6 to the dollar, dollars per euro, now down to 1.25. But these fluctuations, 25, 30, 35%, no company can increase their productivity in a short span of time to offset the impact of these exchange rate changes. So a company, a firm that was competitive at one moment, the exchange rate changes and it no longer can compete in international markets. To make firms have to bear that risk is obviously putting them at an extraordinary disadvantage. China has realized this, and it manages exchange rate to keep it stable and competitive. It may keep it too competitive, but that's another matter. but at least the point I'm making, it recognizes the economics of exchange rate. Now the problem is that if every other country is keeping their exchange rate low and you're not, you're put into a competitive disadvantage. So it's one thing to be in a world where everybody has freely floating exchange rates, but another one where most countries are managing their exchange rate. If you're not managing your exchange rate in a competitive way, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage. But one of the lessons that should have come out from the crisis is that markets are not always efficient and self-correcting. And that includes, they're not necessarily efficient in the determination of the exchange rate. So one can't just rely on the markets. The fluctuations in the exchange rate that I described before are not a manifestation of, you might say, efficient markets. So the first point that I want to raise is part of industrial policy. You might say this is part of macro policy, but it really is an important ingredient in industrial policy of trying to generate manufacturing sectors or service sectors that can compete, or agriculture that can compete with others. The second important ingredient, again, that East Asian countries took on board is access to credit. Unfortunately, the banking system in many countries finds it much more attractive to lend to government, to engage in derivatives, speculation, trying to destroy an economy like Greece, all kinds of other activities that they should be doing rather than what they should be doing, which is lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. And even after, as I mentioned before, even after the U.S. government bailed out the banks to $700 billion, the grounds, the defense of doing that was that it was necessary to maintain the flow of credit lending. The bank said, thank you for the money, but we don't want to lend. And so one of the reasons the American economy is so weak right now is that lending, especially to small and medium-sized enterprises, is very constrained. But this has been a problem in many countries, as I said, around the world. And the response, governments have to, I think, take deliberate actions to maintain, extend access to credit, especially to small and medium-sized enterprises. And in doing that, they have to identify which areas in particular should get access, are areas that are likely to be the basis of future growth. Governments are often criticized for their failures, but we should also recognize some of their successes. An example is in America, Small Business Administration helps give partial guarantees to small business loans, and its record has been very impressive, including Federal Express, a small company. It was a small company. It began, like every big business begins as a small business, and it began with an SBA loan that created a whole new industry, overnight delivery. Well, so that's the fourth ingredient to help create a dynamic learning society. The fifth I want to talk about is creating an innovation system. For an advanced industrial country, the focus on innovation is moving the frontier out. For an emerging market, for a developing country like Egypt, the question is, how do we move to the frontier? One of the most important insights to come out of our understanding of growth in the last developing countries, enormous successes of the last 3 decades, has been that what separates developed from less developed countries is not just a gap in resources, but also a gap in knowledge. 60 years ago, when the World Bank was founded, everybody thought that the critical distinction between developing and developed countries was a shortage of capital. And that's why you created a World Bank. A bank helps transfer capital from the rich to the poor. But now we realize that, yes, capital is important, but it's not as important as knowledge. And the question is, how do you transfer knowledge and close the gap between the developed and the less developed countries? The fact of the matter is that productivity in developing countries is lower than in the advanced industrial countries. The main reason for the productivity is organization and knowledge. And so, most of what the failures in one way or another can in fact be related to knowledge. And that's why this initiatives of access to knowledge are so important. If developing countries don't have access to knowledge, then it becomes more difficult to close the barrier. One of the big debates in the international arena today is this issue of the debate over access to knowledge. Is the international community creating barriers to access to knowledge for developing countries? One of my friends has written a very a book with a title I think that strongly expresses his view about what's happened. It's called Kicking Away the Ladder. And what he argues is that the advanced industrial countries stole knowledge, the United States stole knowledge, did all kinds of things that today would be viewed as terrible. They climbed up the ladder, and now that they're up there, are kicking away the ladder and saying no one else can do what we did in our growth path. Well, that may be a little bit extreme, but the fact is there's a certain element of truth in what he's saying. That the intellectual property regime, for instance, associated with TRIPS, the WTO agreement of 1995, in effect, made access to knowledge for emerging markets more difficult than it was in the past, right? Than it should be. Well, that's a big topic on its own. I want to just mention three aspects of a country's innovation system, a system of closing the knowledge gap. The first I've already talked about, education. It's really at the core of closing the knowledge gap. And particularly the university education system. The second is government-supported research. Government-supported, and many people think, well, emerging markets, can't really be involved in research. That's for advanced industrial countries. Let me very strongly express the view that I think that view is wrong. I flew, I was down in, I had a wonderful vacation down on the Nile, but I flew back on an Embraer airplane. For those of you who don't know, the Embraer airplane is made in Brazil. It's based on a product that was supported by the BNDES, which is the Brazilian Development Bank, a development bank that actually is bigger than the World Bank. But Brazil has not only been very successful in this very visible way of creating one of the most successful mid-range airplanes, but it's also developed technology for making sugar-based ethanol. So successful is Brazilian technology that to compete with Brazilian sugar-based ethanol, the United States has to subsidize export-based ethanol $1 a gallon and tax Brazilian ethanol 50 cents a gallon. $1.50 weight a gallon gap reflecting the advantage of resilient technology. And this is technology result of research done in Brazil. But every country has to do research, in a sense, to adapt products to their own conditions. Malaysia's doing it in palm oil, but these are just a couple of examples. So government-supported research, I think, is important. And then the third is providing the appropriate conditions to incentivize private research, including the appropriate intellectual property framework, and finding that balanced intellectual property framework is not easy, but it means not adopting the framework of TRIPS or the advanced industrial countries. It means finding one that's appropriate to the conditions of Egypt or whatever emerging markets. Well, let me just conclude. The Great Recession, the crisis that we've been through, I think has imposed an enormous amount of pain to people all over the world, enormous economic costs. But perhaps one of the benefits, one of the few benefits, is that it is forcing us to rethink economics. It's forcing policymakers to rethink some of the simple rules that they used before. And I think forcing the economists to rethink the ideas that really have such influence on policymakers around the world. What I've tried to spend most of my time this evening focusing on is that successful development, successful growth, needs to focus on creating a learning society, a learning economy, and focus on dynamic, not static, comparative advantage. That this particular lens of seeing what are good policies is very different from the kinds of ideas that emerge from the Washington Consensus, although there are certain areas of overlap. That there is really a comprehensive agenda that is required if one is going to create this kind of dynamic learning society. In the end, I think that it would make for a more interesting society, a more interesting economy. And in the end, I think this particular approach to development is more likely to bring benefits in terms of economic growth, and if it's well designed, more likely to make sure that those benefits are shared widely within society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stiglitz, for another inspiring lecture, for really thought-provoking issues, and most importantly, I think, other than bringing up the importance of knowledge for development at this particular time, also making us question conventional wisdom as far as knowledge and intellectual property and TRIPS, etc., but also more generally the study of economics, which is really wonderful. Thank you very much. We will open the question and answers, and because the light, I think I will need Karim will have us. Thank you very much. So, the light is in my, I can't see the light.
Thanks, Joe, for such an interesting talk. I go back to the issue of development and access to knowledge of development. I think you nailed it down to education, innovation, and people. I think you're absolutely right. We start with education. It's, as many people would say, it's education. But then you need to innovate. And I don't mean by this only IT, but innovation at large, horizontally. And obviously you need to invest in people. I personally go that far sometimes, and I think that in the 21st century, people are the oil of the 21st century. But then, although we need openness, although we need transparency and diversity, unless the loop is closed with creating jobs, then we have a problem. So having in mind development, technology could be obviously an engine, but unless that innovation is used in creating jobs, well, you have so many people that are well educated. For example, in the public speaking, 300,000 people every year graduate from university, let alone 1.3 million graduate from schools. So unless these find jobs across the board, well, there is an issue there.
You're absolutely right that you have to have employment opportunities for those graduating from college. And that's, in a way, an important aspect of industrial policy, but also innovation policy. Let me try to illustrate this by a particular point. Innovation in the advanced industrial countries has focused on saving labor, but totally ignoring resources in the environment. The environment was treated as if it were a free good. In most developing countries, you don't want to save labor because the real problem is creating jobs. You really want innovation that focuses on what's scarce, which is, in the case of water, other resources. And that's really one of the reasons why I think there's real opportunity for research to be focused in developing countries. Their situation is different, and therefore they ought to be focusing on a different agenda of innovation than the agenda being pursued by many of the companies in the advanced industrial countries. But the second point I emphasize is industrial policies trying to think about how do we promote sectors that are important for our economy, for whatever economy you're talking about. Well, one of the sectors that's important, characteristics of the sectors are those that are labor intensive. Because if you don't absorb labor, you're going to have all kinds of social problems. And it's all, so in my mind, one of the characteristics of good industrial policies is a sensitivity towards the employment issue.
Thank you, Professor. As we're seeing, there's the Washington Consensus for Economic Policy that was promoted for a long time. The same way, there's a lot of prescriptions being sold about how to promote innovation in developing countries. And one of them is that developing countries should emulate the Bayh-Dole Act in the United States, the Bayh-Dole Act, the Bayh-Dole Law. And a lot of countries such as Egypt and India and others are moving towards implementing this Bayh-Dole model of encouraging universities to commercialize their research through intellectual property in particular. And there's a lot of debate about the merits of that and how well they should adapt it and how it should be adapted to developing countries. I wonder if you could have your views on this point. And a related question of innovation is that to promote innovation, you need also natural policies relating to government procurement, for example, local content, industrial policies. And when you go into these areas, you start hitting trade rules, right, that regulate subsidies, government procurement, etc. And you have all this, like, for example, on Chinese indigenous innovation policy, right? So how do you manage this balance, also promoting innovation, also in light of these constraints by global rules? Thank you.
I would like to go back to your explanation of the economic crisis in the US. I have the impression that you did not go far enough in your explanation of the crisis. You attributed to bad policies on the part of the government, and that banks are left free to do whatever they like. And I think somehow this does not convince me. And I would like to know from you whether you think this is just a temporary crisis. It is enough for the government to change its policies, or there is something deeper about this crisis. That is, I would like to go back to what Mark economics said about this contradiction between the capacity of capitalism to produce and its failure to promote consumption. So is there something structural about this crisis? And is there any difference between the crisis in the US and that in Europe? Thank you very much.
We have a couple more, but please try to be brief because time is very limited. So we'll take one here and then here. We'll take a couple more and then we'll have another round.
Okay, thank you for this fruitful conversation. Okay, regarding the economic crisis, market inefficiency, and efficient market hypothesis, I think that the main causes and the main thesis of the financial crisis was in the solution of 1929 financial crisis, which means we had last Stiglitz Act, which differentiated between commercial banks and investment banks, which were the main cause because we have the Fed doesn't supervise the investment banks. Also, we had government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which caused the mortgage crisis. So I would like you to differentiate between financial fragility and financial instability. What's the relation between them? Thank you.
We have one more.
In my limited experience in the U.S. Academy, it's always struck me how economics departments in many American universities have consigned both economic history and the history of economic thought to the margins of the discipline as a whole, and how much education in economics has really become dominated by economic theory, neoclassical theory in particular. And I was reminded of this when you were speaking about the ideology of market fundamentalism that's come to dominate economic thinking in the past few decades. So I'm curious to know what's your general assessment of the field as a whole and where it's going in the future, and whether the current economic crisis can help transform the discipline from its current state. Thank you.
Okay, great questions. Let me take them in order. I'm very suspect of the buy gold provision. This was an attempt to encourage universities to do research by encouraging them to get patents on the products that came out of that research. And it's had a very bad effect in the sense that when universities go from being open, transparent, to being a profit-maximizing institution, it leads to a closing in of research, closing in of ideas. People start worrying about if I tell somebody else in another university, maybe they'll get the patent before me. So it's had a very negative effect on the atmosphere in some university departments. I think I've been very critical of the patent system. It has some disadvantages I described. If you can get the benefits of innovation without the cost, it's much better to do that. And that's why I think publicly supported university research is better than trying to do it indirectly through a patent system, which is distorting. Now, obviously, if there are problems in general getting revenues to help support university research, and one has to think about the trade-offs and the absence of adequate revenues, but in general, it's not a provision that I support. The second question had to do with the use of local content and other strategies. Let me first express the view that I do think there's an important role for government to try to encourage global IT entrepreneurship in this area. So let me give you an example. That in Brazil, they installed on all government funded computers the Linux as opposed to Microsoft. Now, why was that important? Well, it's an open source framework that allowed other people to come in and be supported by local entrepreneurs rather than through a monopoly-based system. So there are actual ways that you can actually encourage more open, more domestic entrepreneurship that the government can undertake. That's perfectly consistent with the WTO rules. Now the final point is related that some countries have taken an overly narrow view of TRIPS than they have to. TRIPS is the intellectual property provision of the WTO. An example of this, the kind of issue, what is that issue, is in India. One of the drug companies, one of the things that drug companies try to do is what we call evergreening their patents. When the patent comes to an end, they make a small modification and try to get another 17 years of protection. And in the case of one particular example involving Novartis, an NGO challenged the patent and won in the courts, in the Indian courts. Obviously, international drug companies don't like that. But the point is, there are enormous degrees of discretion. Compulsory licenses, standards for novelty, a whole set of conditions under which patents, standards for opposition. The procedures used in Europe are different from the United States for granting a patent. All these are frameworks that emerging markets can make a choice. And they can make choices that are more supportive to creating innovation in the emerging markets themselves. So, unfortunately, too often they listen to those outsiders who say, follow the American law. The interesting thing is, Americans, most of the high-tech people in the United States, actually are afraid that are very critical of the American intellectual property regime. Because the problem we call patent thickets, every time, some of you probably have BlackBerries. As you know, BlackBerry was sued, saying it had trespassed in somebody else's suit. The other company threatened to shut it down. It turned out that the other suits were invalid, and the other patents were invalid, but because it had no choice, it had to pay something like more than $600 million in ransom to keep operating. A real barrier to doing innovation. So one has to monitor this very carefully. On the crisis, it's really interesting that how it's generated an enormous amount of disagreement about what was the fundamental cause of it. The right in the United States blames the government. They say markets would have been efficient but for the intervention of government. And they always find, what are the complaints? They complain about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government housing agency. They complain about the Federal Reserve having interest rates too low. As I said, I think the government was partly to blame, but the blame of the government is not stopping the private sector from making its mistakes that it does over and over again. If you look at where the subprime mortgage problems originated, it wasn't in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. These are the two government agencies. They aren't government agencies. They're private sector. They were privatized in 1968. So to blame the government for a company that was privatized in 1968 is a little bit curious. But even if they were a government, they entered into the fray, into the market, years after the private sector began issuing the subprime mortgage. On the issue of the low interest rates, blaming the Fed for low interest rates, my response to that is a little bit, what company would say the reason I lost money is my workers were working for too low wages? Obviously, if a company said that, we'd say it's absurd. Well, banks are in the business of taking capital and allocating it. What's their input? The input is the source of funds. They're complaining that they were getting funds at too low of an interest rate, and therefore they misused it. It's, to me, it's really an indication of sloppy thinking and lack of critical thinking. So, in my mind, this attempt to shift blame is just that, an attempt to shift blame. Now, Glass-Steagall repeal did, I think, play a role. As I say, Glass-Steagall led to bigger banks, too big to fail. Concentration of the banking system in the years after Glass-Steagall was repealed increased a great deal. You have the risk culture of the investment bank extended to the depository institutions. And you had large conflicts of interest, which were the reasons that we originally passed Glass-Steagall in the aftermath of the Great Depression. But let me say, there are universal banks, say in Europe, and some of them have worked reasonably well. But that's because you have regulators that understand universal banks. The situation in the United States was the worst possible. We had no regulation and the risk culture of gambling. And that was a recipe for disaster. So, in my mind, it's the combination of the two. Now, the question is this a structural problem? Is it inevitable in capitalism? I don't think so. I mean, yes, we've had lots of crises, but there was a 40-year period in which the world did not have a crisis. And that was the 40 years after the Great Depression, when the United States and most other countries adopted strong regulations because they saw what had caused the problem before. And then what happened? Because we didn't have a crisis, people concluded we don't need to have regulations. The reason we didn't have a crisis is because we had good regulations. And they got rid of the regulations, and then in the last 30 years, we've had more than 100 financial crises around the world. So the answer is that regulations, when they're well designed, can make a very big difference. The final point, the teaching of economics. I think it was a big mistake in the economics department to discontinue teaching economic history. If people had taught economic history, they would have realized that there have been crises every 10 years since the beginning of the modern economy. They would have been more skeptical about some of the ideology. There's an interesting initiative going on right now, something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking, that has been funded very generously by some philanthropists. So far it's raised about $75 million, but it hopes to get to somewhat twice that or more to fund research that is based on trying to learn the lessons of the crisis and to be critical of you might say, the market fundamentalist approach. So it's gotten a lot of support also from a number of governments in terms of intellectual support. So I think there is a moment of rethinking. What is a little sad to me is the economics profession is not changed as quickly as I would have hoped. There's an old expression that old ideas die one by one as the members of the profession die. That it's only when the older generation leaves the scene that new ideas come on. And unfortunately, there may be too much truth in that particular perspective.
Okay, we are short short of time, we'll take a couple of more questions. I know the gentleman here has been very patient, and there is one question on the side that Rania is pointing to. We'll take 2 questions. Please make it very brief. Thank you very much. So the gentleman, go ahead, please. Sir. Please make it very brief, okay? 1 minute. Less than a minute.
Thanks, for Professor Stiglitz for the lecture. Sir, I enjoyed your ideas for a long time, especially your idea about market perfections and market fair and the comparison between Russian shop and Chinese experience, and your idea about globalization is a matter of managing the issue, and especially your idea about the advice of International Monetary Fund, which depend upon assumptions that doesn't hold and doesn't make sense. My question for you, sir. My question for you, sir, is according to your very high academic and developmental process framework experience, what do you suggest for developing countries that didn't get the trend of globalization, especially in the area of the rule state?
Sorry, sir, advice for developing countries who didn't get the trend?
In the area of the rule state.
The area of?
The rural state.
The rural state.
Rural states. I'm not sure. Is that rural states? Okay, there's one last question on this side. I can't.
My question will be 40 seconds and 40 o'clock on.
Okay.
Number 1. I will agree with something you said, and I'll ask you about something you didn't say, tell me I'm right or wrong. I disagree about what we have done to the Brazilian, corn meal gasoline fully. However, the Greenspan is a genius. I think Obama made a big mistake by getting Bill Bernanke, who was the head of the Federal Reserve in New York, and made the big mess, although there were no regulations to control it, and made him his big guy. That is absolutely wrong in my opinion. Then I think you didn't speak about, I want to get your comment, is when you speak about big bank like Citibank would fail, would cause a disaster. I disagree with that point. Why? We have Bank of America, blah, blah, and the Wall Street guys. If Citibank, which is my bank, and by the way, the Pan Am building, failed, let's say he had 1 million customers, that will not shake our economy. But if 500 banks in Scotland or Ireland fail, I think the disaster magnitude is equal in both places. So in a way, I'm disagreeing with you saying, it's a bad scenario for one big bank to fall. Thank you, and thank you for giving me an intellectual orgasm.
Thank you very much. We have responses by Professor Stiglitz. Please.
I wasn't sure I understood the first question about, let me make a couple comments about rural development. Is that what? Oh, the role of the state. The role of the state, okay. Now, okay, role of the state, okay. I think it's, one of the things I said in my talk very explicitly is, I think the lessons that come out of the fall of the Berlin Wall and experiences before that was that no state can run a modern economy. Central planning can't work. I think the lesson to come out of the fall of Lehman Brothers is that market fundamentalism also doesn't work. That the two pole cases of trying to rely everything on markets or everything on government, neither of those two extremes work. You have to get some kind of balance. I also would argue you need a balance where there's other parties, civil society, other kinds of institutions besides for-profit and government. Most of the universities, all the successful universities in America, for instance, are neither private sector in the sense that they are for-profit. Only for-profit universities tend to be exploitive of the least educated people to trying to make profits off of them. Nor are they, and they're in this third area of civil society or NGOs, non-for-profits. So the question is how to get that balance where there are checks and balances on each other. There's no simple formula because different countries will be in different situations. In general, I think what you find is that there's a tendency to swing from one extreme to another. When countries have had too large of a government, they have a tendency to go to the other extreme and have too small. And it's really trying to get that balance between the two is critical, and there are many dimensions on this balance. So, for instance, let me just give you an example. Many people, after the problems, the failures of planning, have moved away from planning. But I think that's a little bit wrong. You still need to have a sense of vision of where the economy is going, where society is going. And the government, even in a market economy, is going to be spending 10, 15, 20% of GDP. It has to have a sense of where that money is going. So you still need to have some thought about where society is going. It's not a top-down plan in the form that we had 50 years ago, but you still need some kind of plan. You need, as everybody here must know, you need urban planning as well. Without some thought about the externalities that are caused by the way people are located, you can get into some transportation problems, as some of you may know. It seems this issue of getting this balance between the two is to me really the big challenge facing every society, and it should be actually a source of a very big discussion. Well, let me talk about the second question. There are many ways in which financial systems can fail. Undoubtedly, even if we did everything that we are supposed to do, learned every lesson of the current crisis to make sure that we don't repeat get another crisis like the last crisis, the financial sector is so innovative it will find a new way to create a crisis. So I have complete confidence in the ability of the financial sector in that sense. But we haven't yet learned the lessons of the last crisis. So I think we shouldn't make it so easy to create another crisis. I think we should at least try to stop the failures that we've had in the past. Now, the point I was trying to make about the too big to fail banks is it's a simple problem of incentives. It's distorted incentives. If you have extraordinarily good regulators, you can deal with the problem of big banks because you are aware of their incentives and you try to stop it. But American regulators are not up to the task, at least based on historical experience. And so from my point of view of American regulators, for us, I think it's an easy question. We aren't able to deal with that problem. But what is also clear is you can have very many medium-sized banks doing very similar kinds of things and have a banking crisis. We call that a correlated risk, and there are tendencies, there are incentives
for the banks to do very similar things. Once you understand this, one of the objectives of good policy is to create diversity. Those of you in biology know that one of the things that you want to do in agriculture is make sure that not everybody plants the same identical seed varieties, because if you have a disease, it will destroy your whole crop. You need diversity. And the same thing is true in economics. You need diversity. And unfortunately, the way the models have been going is to encourage everybody to do the same thing. And that means you get correlated risk. And that means the probability of systemic failure, is what we call it, systemic failure, goes up. So that's one of the things that we need to be more sensitive about. Some people talked about it before. The remarkable thing of our financial authorities is that before the crisis, they didn't even talk about systemic risk. They didn't even think about it. In the UK, there was some, in the Bank of England, there was some good research going on the issue. But in most of the central banks, nobody even addressed the issue. I can't help but I can't resist the Caesar comment about the Federal Reserve in New York episode. I just wanted to make one point, which is it's really very important to create transparent central banks. There's a real tendency of central banks to believe in secrecy. Money is power. Power and secrecy gives you money and power. And so central banks like secrecy, and they resisted, the Federal Reserve resisted disclosing what it did in the current crisis. We now understand why. Because when Congress insisted that they disclose what they were doing, it turned out that, for instance, the largest recipient of money in the AIG bailout was a single investment bank that happened to be very influential in American politics. And the next two recipients were foreign banks. And the idea that American taxpayers were being used to bail out a number of foreign banks did not go over well. So we now understand why the central bank did not want to have transparency. But it's also as we understand that, we also understand why transparency is an important part even of central banks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stiglitz, I think we'll have to, President Lisa has closing remarks. We can take questions later, then we'll have a reception outside.
Joe Stiglitz has made a career out of sharing information, revealing the hidden and sometimes corrosive influence of ignorance, of groupthink, of conventional wisdom. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on asymmetric information, and he has won the admiration and respect of people around the world for his willingness, indeed insistence, on talking about things they may not know. That includes generations of his students and his role as policy advocate, policymakers around the world. His willingness to talk straight, tell you what you need to know in a way that you can use it, characterizes his entire approach to his work. Tonight is a case in point, and for that he has acquired, I am sure, yet another room full of admirers. This is a dynamic society in uncertain times here in Egypt, and we are deeply grateful to Joe for his accent on the value of learning and the various ways it happens. We have a small present for him. It is a book published by AUC Press on Egypt, and he will use it to remember his visit here. And we would like to invite all of you to join us for a reception in Oriental Hall next door now. Thank you very much.